Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dorothy Lazard. I'm the head librarian here at the Oakland History Center of the Oakland Public Library. We're on the second floor of the main library. If you haven't come to visit us, please do. And it's my pleasure tonight to host what is going to be our last program in our fall history series. Every year we have sponsored a fall history series for the past several years, and it's been a real pleasure to learn about all different aspects of Oakland history and to share those things with the public. So I'm glad you're all here with us tonight. We have a fascinating speaker talking about a really fascinating subject, and just let a few more people in before we get started. All right. Okay. So Gary Fogel is an adjunct professor of aerospace engineering at San Diego State University and the CEO of Natural Selection Incorporated, a computer science company in San Diego. He's also the author of 4 books about aviation history, including Quest for Flight, John H. Montgomery and the Dawn of Aviation in the West, which he co-wrote with Craig S. Harwood. And tonight he's going to talk to us about his latest book, which is Skyrider, Park Van Tassel and the Rise of Ballooning in the West. Here's the book here. We have our copy here at the Oakland History Center, and hopefully we'll have many more throughout our system to check out. And so I want to introduce you to Gary Fogel on our last Fall History Series program. So Gary, take it away.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you for the opportunity to come present today. I really appreciate that. It's a pleasure. I hope everyone can see the screen. Dorothy, can you just confirm that you can see the screen?
Yeah, I could see the screen.
Okay, perfect. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about this book featuring Park Van Tassel and his history, not only introducing ballooning to the West, but introducing ballooning to the world. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to do this in Oakland because the story definitely revolves around Oakland. Many of us are familiar with hot air ballooning, like the kind you're seeing here at the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta. I had the privilege of going out there a few weeks ago to be a part of that. After the pandemic, it was great to be in such an open and wonderful environment watching so many balloons launch. That's hot air ballooning, that's modern hot air ballooning. And we almost take ballooning for granted now because it's so easy to do and so fun. But there was a time not long ago when ballooning was much, much harder and quite the challenge. And it's only been within the last 250 years or so that we've been doing these things. And so let me just remind you a brief history about that early ballooning flight as it relates to Park Van Tassel. The first hot air balloon flights were made by the Montgolfier brothers in France in 1783. It took 10 years for the balloon to make it to America. Blanchard made the first balloon flight in the US. Many of our founding fathers were there for that first flight. George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were there all watching this amazing accomplishment of someone actually going up in the air for the first time. It's kind of like a SpaceX launch at the time. And then in France in 1797, Gagarin was the first to make a parachute jump from a balloon. Having the guts to jump out of a balloon with a parachute and float back down to Earth again. It was not a flexible parachute, but a rigid parachute. That worked. And again, it took some time for that to get to America. The first parachute jump we're aware of was made by Louis Giel in New York in 1819. And so balloons were used for exhibition, used during the Civil War for reconnaissance in the 1840s to 1870s. It wasn't really until after the gold rush even that the balloon came to the West. And the very first recorded balloon flight of anyone west of the Rockies was a 16-year-old man named Joseph Gates, who made the first flight at Oakland, of all places. So credit Oakland to its ballooning history, the first place in the West to actually have a balloon flight. At the time, there was another gentleman that was going to make a balloon flight, but the balloon wasn't inflated enough to carry him aloft. So they found a young boy and he volunteered to go up instead. And that was Joseph Gates, a very courageous young man. So in that same year, in 1853, a gentleman named Park Van Tassel was born in Indiana. And as a child, he encountered balloons for the first time at the village fair in Ohio and was captivated by this idea of people actually going up in balloons. People at that time had never seen or heard of anyone actually going up aloft in the air. It was a brand new kind of concept. He married his sweetheart, Elizabeth Spencer, in Indiana. They had one son, but that marriage didn't last very long. You'll have to count with me on the number of wives that he goes through as part of this story. That was wife number one. He moves in 1879 to Stockton, California. And while in Stockton, near Stockton, San Joaquin, he marries Ella Block, wife number two. They have a son named Harry. It's not clear what became of Harry. But what is clear is that while you're in Stockton, Van Tassel acquires a large balloon from a balloonist named F.F. Martin in San Francisco. F.F. Martin was one of the early balloonists in the Bay Area to really start experimenting with balloons in the 1860s. And Van Tassel tries to make two ascensions with this new balloon, both of which were fizzles in the newspaper as they were reported, one at Stockton and one at Sacramento. This balloon stuff is harder than it looks, and he's really having a difficult time. He and his wife, Ella, moved to Albuquerque in July of 1881. This is about the same time as the OK Corral at Tombstone. So you get the picture of the early West and what life was like in this pioneering part of America. New Mexico was still a territory at the time. And Park Van Tassel operated the Elite Tavern, a saloon in the Opera House in what is now downtown Albuquerque, but was then Newtown, Albuquerque, at the northwest corner of 2nd Street and Railroad Avenue. And although his name had only one L in Van Tassel, I guess so many people mistook that and put two L's in. He started even adopting his own name, Van Tassel, with two L's in his own advertising. But as a part of all of that, once they're settled, one of the first things he does is he ships a balloon from San Francisco by rail to Albuquerque because he wants to still try to make a flight and a balloon flight in Albuquerque. Now, no one had made any sort of balloon flight in Albuquerque. This is a picture of Albuquerque in 1882, and you get the idea of the Old West background. But on July 4th, 1882, he decides that he's going to make this launch. It takes 2 days to inflate this gas balloon with the gas that's in town to get this balloon to be inflated enough to actually go up in the air. Albuquerque had just received illuminating gas for the lighting of the town, and that was made by coal, by burning coal. And so in order to get this balloon filled, it required 2 days of the entire city's gas to fill the balloon. And the balloon was only still 2/3 full at the time of July 4th. And he had promised to make a flight. So here it's getting late on July 4th. By 6:15, he decides it's time to launch, but the balloon will not go up in the air unless he takes out most of the ballast that he had planned to take on board. When ballooning like this, you go up with ballast so that on the way back down, you can throw out the ballast and reduce your rate of descent and hopefully make a good landing. But he launched on July 4th at 6:15 with hardly any ballast at all and rose to 14,000 feet as measured by his barometer, and then came back down at a rather accelerated rate, but making a safe landing at a cornfield near Old Town, Albuquerque. And not only was that Van Tassel's first successful flight, it was the first successful flight by anyone in all of the New Mexico territory. So hailed as the first to fly in New Mexico. This is a picture of that particular event. There aren't many pictures of the event itself, but this is one rare picture of the actual installation of that gas balloon before it takes off. He tries again. So Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was a city to the northeast of Albuquerque, had asked Van Tassel to come do an exhibition there. But in August of 1882, there were strong winds that damaged the balloon. And on another attempt, he just couldn't get enough inflation in the gas that was used for the balloon to actually get up in the air. He tried inviting a lighter weight pilot to try to go up in the air, even it wouldn't go up with the lighter weight pilot. So another fizzle. And he returns to Albuquerque to try to make another flight at the second annual New Mexico Territorial State Fair in September of 1882. And during that event, as they're trying to hold the balloon, getting it ready, the balloon escapes from all the people holding the ropes, and it goes aloft without anyone on board, especially Van Tassel, another big fizzle. And now the papers are wondering, hey, this hero of ours that could figure this stuff out on July 4th, now is he really a fraud? Does he know what he's doing? And of the 5 flights he's tried, only one's been successful. This is the rate of success when trying to do ballooning in the Old West. He leaves Albuquerque, really, he leaves Albuquerque because almost Albuquerque wants him to go. It was that bad. And at the same time he's leaving Albuquerque, his wife leaves for California. It's not clear if they had a falling out or what was happening at the time. But Van Tassel continues on to Utah, making what is believed to be the first balloon flight, gas ascension balloon flight in Utah's history on July 4th of 1883, another July 4th mission. This time he flies from Washington Square, where this building still exists today in Salt Lake City, with a monkey as his passenger, so his first passenger, and he flies to 15,000 feet and makes a successful flight. He's getting his wings. And then he makes the second flight later that same month, taking up Mrs. Fanny Hoyt with him for a 6.5-hour mission over the Wasatch Range, a great balloon flight. Now, that flight was fantastic because of its length and journey, but what made the papers was that a married man, Park Van Tassel, had taken up someone else's wife into a balloon for 6.5 hours. That made the papers. After this success, he leaves for San Francisco, collects his thoughts, and goes straight away to Oregon, making what's believed to be the first balloon flight in Portland in September of 1883. Also several ascensions, other ascensions in Oregon, and also making a flight at the State Fair in Oregon at Salem in November of 1883. Another wonderful flight to 9,000 feet. He's really getting the hang of this ballooning stuff. He comes back to San Francisco, makes some more ascensions at San Francisco, Stockton, and Los Angeles, and now starts construction on a very large balloon, this Eclipse balloon, 58 feet in diameter and 110 feet tall. And that was first test flown at Central Park, which was a baseball field at 8th and Market Streets in San Francisco in November of 1884. That flight, that first test flight, was rather amazing. He takes off with 2 passengers on board this very large balloon. The winds take him out over the San Francisco Bay, and they start meandering all around the bay. The winds are just from the east near Oakland and from the west near San Francisco, and it just sticks out over the bay. And pretty soon it's time to start coming down, but there's no way to get back to land. So they end up landing in the bay, requiring a boat rescue. On the way down, they're throwing out as much ballast as possible. They're taking off their clothes. Anything that goes out the door can go out the door, just to try to get back down safely. And they require a boat rescue to get it back to shore. But Van Tassel, having now had a very large balloon capable of taking many passengers, makes a statement to the press that he's going to be able to fly all the way from San Francisco over the Sierra Nevada to Nevada. That kind of an idea at the time was fantasy, was science fiction. How could you ever go over the mountain range? That's not possible. And so this made also national news that Park Van Tassel had a balloon that could do this kind of a crazy flight. He then decides, he gets hired to go to the World's Fair in 1885 in New Orleans to provide an exhibition of ballooning. He's now becoming such a national known Professor Van Tassel of ballooning that they hire him to do this in March of 1885. And just as before, he has difficulty getting to full inflation with this balloon. So having to launch, because he's been paid to launch on a particular time at a particular day, he has to launch with the balloon only partially inflated, which means he's only going to go up to a lower altitude than expected. He goes up to 4,000 feet and lands on the west side of the Mississippi. So the Mississippi River makes a big curve at New Orleans, and near Algiers, he lands on the west side of the Mississippi. And as he gets out of the balloon continues to go without his weight in the balloon and goes bounding across the Mississippi to the other side. And so now he has to finally try to collect the balloon from the other side in all the swamps and stuff and get it back. Eventually, he did recover the balloon, brought it back to San Francisco. And this event created, again, more favorable national press for this wonderful balloonist, Park Van Tassel. He comes back to San Francisco and divorces Ella and marries another woman, Clara Kuykendall. Now, Clara was of high society in San Jose. Her parents were very high society, and they did not approve of this marriage of their young daughter to this gallivanting aeronaut who's going around traveling, doing this crazy exhibition stuff with balloons. So much so that they didn't attend the wedding. They didn't want any part of the wedding, but they married anyway. And Park Van Tassel started thinking, hey, maybe it's possible to take couples aloft to go get married in the air. If we could have a tethered balloon and a pastor that would go along, they could do their vows in the air. Wouldn't that be great? It was very hard to convince the pastors to go up in the air. So maybe sometimes the wedding was done ahead of time and then they can go up for their honeymoon, kind of a thing. He makes another tour of the West, this time coming down to Los Angeles first, again, July 4th, 1886, making a wonderful 1-hour flight with 2 passengers over Los Angeles, another one, a very similar flight the next day. And now he makes propositions of not just flying over California, but flying all the way in a balloon across North America. again, just out of the world crazy science fiction. Of course, now we do have balloons that can cross North America. It's done in a gas balloon race at Albuquerque as a part of the international fiesta on every year if they try. But back then, that was an amazing thing that made international news that someone was proposing such a thing. He continues to go to Denver. There are people that credit Van Tassel with making the first balloon flight in Colorado's history, although that flight was only a few hundred feet up because of the altitude of Denver, and again, having difficulty getting things inflated. He only had enough ascension to go up, just a few hundred feet. He goes to Kansas City, Missouri. He makes a fine ascension there in Kansas City, but at these events, he's realizing a particular dream of his to make a career out of aerial exhibition. Of course, there were people like P.T. Barnum and Buffalo Bill Cody that were traveling the West by rail, making a living and doing circus acts, effectively, things of that nature. But Van Tassel was, I can bring the balloon to people. They've never seen anyone go up in the air. They'll pay money to see me go up in the air. They'll pay a little bit of money to go inside an enclosure to watch me inflate the balloon and be a part of the launching area, and then and go off. Then I can make enough money doing that kind of system to pay for my next trip to my next city and go by rail in this way of making a living as a career. Back then, that was a brand new idea. And of course, as people pay their nickel to get inside the enclosure, if you're doing a balloon, all you have to do is stay outside the enclosure and not pay anything. You're still going to see the balloon go up because it's up in the air. So at Kansas City, 90% of the crowd was outside of the enclosure, and Van Tassel asked a policeman to try to help bring people in to the enclosure so that he could make more money. It was very difficult to get people to get that police officer to actually help with the thing. The police officer and Van Tassel have an altercation. Van Tassel gets arrested, has to figure out how to get out of jail after this great flight in Kansas City. But still, it's just proving how difficult this was at the time for him. He comes back to San Francisco with a new idea. If people are willing to pay 5 cents to see me launch with a balloon, I have to add something more to the exhibition to get them to pay me 10 cents. What's the next sort of level that I can go up to up my game in this aerial exhibition type thing? And maybe jumping out of the balloon with a parachute would be the next thing that I could do. So Van Tassel comes back to San Francisco, starts designing a flexible parachute that can be used to jump out of a balloon. At the same time he comes back, there's a gentleman named Thomas Baldwin, who is a tightrope walker doing the tightrope act at the Cliff House. The Cliff House is on the west side of San Francisco, if you're familiar, with a rope that goes out to Seal Rock and just going off over the water, trying to do tightrope walking. It becomes very famous for these tightrope exhibitions in the late 1880s, and clearly is also thinking about how to make exhibitions as a living to make money. Thomas Baldwin hears about Van Tassel's interest in parachuting, and then together they make an agreement to make these kinds of experiments at the Mechanics Pavilion in San Francisco. This is directly in downtown San Francisco today. The building's no longer there, but the site was in downtown. This is a very large building, very tall building, and they agree to these experiments in the fall of 1886. The initial experiments were made from the rafters of the building with parachutes connected to weights to just understand how a parachute will work and design the parachute effectively with a hole at the top so that the air can rush through the parachute and not cause the swaying motion as you go down. They figure that out. They make a flexible parachute that works. Thomas Baldwin and Van Tassel make their own little tiny jumps in this building, but now it's time to really test the system. So they set up a balloon. They strap the parachute to a small dog, and they put the dog over the side of the basket and see if it's going to work. And sure enough, the dog survives the fall from 3,000 feet. That was the first test. You have to test it somehow, I guess. So now the question is, okay, we know the dog can survive. Who's next? Is it Van Tassel or is it Baldwin? And Baldwin immediately jumps on the opportunity, goes to a local trolley company and says, hey, pay me $1 for every foot you want me to jump from. So if you want me to go to 1,000 feet and jump, pay me $1,000. They agree to that. Why a trolley company? Because they're going to arrange the jump at one of the terminus for the trolley, and everyone's going to want to take the trolley to get to this jump. So the trolley company is going to make money. Van Tassel and Baldwin are going to make money. Everyone's happy. 1,000 feet, $1,000 in 1887 is $30,000 today. I don't know if someone paid me $30,000 if I'd be able to jump out of a balloon or not with a parachute, but okay. So they make these initial arrangements to jump on on January 30th of 1887 near the Cliff House with the tethered Eclipse balloon. And this is the first successful parachute jump in Western American history. It's likely the first parachute jump since Gill's event in New York in 1819. So they were building these parachutes without really having an understanding of history or who else has done this thing. It's brand new invention as far as they're concerned. These are the only two photos we're aware of this event. Very fortunately, the San Francisco History Center had them available. And on the left, you can see Baldwin standing on the side of the basket. The parachute is here attached to the balloon, and the weight of Baldwin's going to pull this loose from the balloon. And of course, as soon as Baldwin leaves, all of that weight leaves the balloon's going to go skyrocketing up, and Baldwin's going to come falling back down. And this is the parachute that's open. You can barely make Baldwin out here with the ropes. It's very difficult to see, but of course, these are amazing photos. And that's the first parachute jump in Western American history. At those events, Baldwin and Van Tassel were associated with, were helped with another associate named William Ivey, who took on the moniker of being Thomas Baldwin's brother, Ivey Baldwin. He wasn't really a brother, but that was the moniker. And as soon as this was realized that it was possible to do these kinds of parachute jumping, Thomas Baldwin and William Ivey left for Quincy, Illinois, Thomas Baldwin's hometown, making parachute jumps there from balloons, then on to New York, and then on to London, England, to make parachute jumps from balloons all across England for lots and lots and lots of money. That left Van Tassel wondering, okay, now how do I have the nerve to do this? Or how am I going to generate my income? Because this whole idea was for me to generate income, but now the guy that I was associated with has skipped town, and I'm left not having any income that's any better than I had before. And that became a big problem for Van Tassel throughout his journeys, as you'll see. I should mention that as Baldwin went to England, he patented the parachute in 1888 with a co-inventor, Farini. Farini was a sort of serial entrepreneur that patented all sorts of things, not having to do necessarily with aviation, but knew the patent landscape. And this patent, it was never credited back to Van Tassel. Baldwin got all the credit for the parachute. It has the same hole in top that they invented. And there's no record of Van Tassel ever getting compensated for that or even knowing that this patent existed during the time. So Van Tassel was hired very quickly thereafter by the San Francisco Examiner newspaper to take a photographer aloft in the balloon to take pictures of the city from the air. People had now seen people go up in balloons, but no one had seen what it looked like to be from the balloon looking back down at their city. And these were some of the first aerial photos of California. They repeated the same feat for the Los Angeles Examiner in June of that year. And those were the first aerial photos of LA. And those photos in both of those Examiner papers that were written by the same editor, the editor of those papers was William Randolph Hearst, who at a young age 24, was thinking very much outside the box about things like this. And that really helped galvanize interest in these papers. Looking at these pictures of their cities from the air was quite amazing. One of those photos still exists. This is the photo, or one of the photos taken from the balloon over Los Angeles. And you can see Los Angeles Plaza there in West 2nd Street and the LA River in the background. This is, all those places still exist today. And we should have all bought real estate back then. But this is one of the photos. He immediately goes on another tour, this time scheduled to make parachute jumps. And his first stop is in San Jose in August of 1887, but there's an accident that happens as the balloon is going up. The parachute drops off the balloon, and so there's no jump. And this is another thing that starts happening: is Van Tassel getting concerned? Are these accidents really accidents, or are they maybe scheduled accidents? Who knows? He makes another balloon in 1888. He travels to San Diego, where I'm at currently, making a successful balloon flight across San Diego Bay in 1888, just shortly after the Hotel del Coronado was completed. That's the only time he comes to San Diego. But from San Diego, he goes to Los Angeles. And his wife, Clara, I think at this point was so enthralled with parachuting and the whole idea, and so disappointed that Baldwin had taken the idea to the UK, that she makes the statement to Park that it's my time, I'm going to jump. If you're not going to jump, I'm going to make the parachute jump. Let's go do it. And of course, at this time in 1888, this is not something that women did. And of course, this is during the time of women's rights and all the protests that went along with that. And for a woman to make that kind of a bold statement and go do this was really, really, really revolutionary. So they make the arrangements to make this jump from Los Angeles on July 4th, 1888. It's another July 4th event. And word gets out that Clara is the one who's going to make the jump. And there are people in Los Angeles who don't feel it's right for this to happen on July 4th, that a woman's going to make a parachute jump. And maybe she's committing suicide on July 4th. Who would ever do that? So they get the police to actually come to try to stop the event. And upon hearing that they're going to stop the event, the Van Tassels and a friend decide to launch early so that the police can't catch them. So they launch at 10:47 from near Los Angeles downtown, and they fly to about 5,000 feet over Pasadena near Arroyo Seco, where this famous bridge is. And at that time, she jumps out of the balloon, successfully landing and making the first parachute by a woman in the Western US. That event made not only national news, but international news for the next 6 months, that someone, a woman, would be able to jump and do this kind of event in the same fashion as Baldwin in the UK, made it all the way back to the UK, and I'm sure Baldwin knew about it. That was amazing. She was a hero at the time for doing this. They came to San Jose, Clara's hometown, to try to repeat this, but there was a whole bunch of issues with getting the gas inflation working correctly. The whole mechanism didn't work. People had already paid money to see the event, but it wasn't going to happen. How do you refund people that are now in the thing? It was a big melee, a total disaster at that point, and they were lucky to just escape the scene. After that event, Park realized that he should be the one doing the parachute jumping, and that it would be better better for his sanity if Clara would no longer be doing the parachute jumping, although Clara probably still wanted to do the parachute jumping. Park continues on to the Northwest to make parachute jumps on his own. He goes to Portland, tries to make a parachute jump, but again, there's an accident and there's no parachute jump. He finally goes to Seattle in November of 1888 and makes a successful parachute jump. But this is a harrowing experience. The first 500 feet of that fall, the parachute doesn't open. He's falling like a brick, and finally it opens right away, and he's hanging on to an iron ring to try to keep balanced, and the force of the parachute opening makes him almost release the iron ring and fall. And the reporters are stunned that the most exciting part was the part where the parachute opened and he almost died. That's how they write it up in the papers. And he makes a safe landing at the foot of Seattle and near Denny Way and is rescued from the water. He makes a second jump at San Francisco near the Cliff House in front of 10,000 spectators. And again, another harrowing diving experience. Parachute doesn't open in time. He barely makes it and survives. And parachuting is just not for Park Van Tassel. Here's a picture again from the History Center of what things looked like at the time. We're not sure that this is exactly Park Van Tassel's launch, but you get the idea of how many people would show up to these kinds of events to watch this ballooning and parachuting exhibition. Park Van Tassel travels then to Salt Lake City because he's hired to make a jump from a balloon under a parachute. He travels all the way to Salt Lake City in 1889, and he realizes as he arrives that he's brought the wrong balloon. It's his wife's balloon. It's a smaller balloon, and that balloon is too small for his weight. There's no way that he's going to be able to go up in this balloon. But he's already been engaged to do this event, so that's a difficult. If you read the little thing, it says here, Great Van Tassel, who's been engaged at great expense. Even in the advertising, they're saying that they paid him a lot of money. He arrives and he finds that there's two other competitors doing ballooning and parachute jumping. There's a gentleman named James Price and a lady named Millie Viola, who are in the same area at the same time doing parachute jumping. So, how do you get around this? He's going to look like a fraud for sure. He finds a gentleman named Dudley Cochran, who's never flown in a balloon and never done a parachute jump in his life. And Dudley Cochran had actually in a bar had been joking that Van Tassel will never do this and it's all a fraud and it's not going to happen. Van Tassel walks up to him and says, "I'll pay you $400 if you'll make the jump for me, because I'm not making the jump because I'm too heavy and my balloon's too small." And $400, that's a lot of money. So Dudley Cochran said, "Okay, I'll do it." And so on this day, on May 26th, Dudley Cochran's the one that goes up in the balloon above the clouds, jumps out of the balloon through the clouds with a parachute and makes a landing in Salt Lake, in the lake itself, but is rescued. And at the time, people thought it was the Great Van Tassel doing this jump, but actually years later, Dudley Cochran owned up that it was actually him that did the jump. Kind of crazy. As Van Tassel was now convinced he's not the type to do parachute jumping, he has to find someone that's going to do this for him. He finds a gentleman named Joe Lawrence from near the Albuquerque area. to become his aeronaut, do these parachute jumps for him. And on July 4th, 1889, at Albuquerque, they try to make another parachute jump from a balloon, and this is another failed attempt. Joe Lawrence is now masquerading as Park Van Tassel's brother, Joe Van Tassel, a member of the family. And they leave Albuquerque again without success or fanfare, this hero of Albuquerque that can't get it to work again, unfortunately. But on the way back to San Francisco, at every major city, they stop to make jumps and practice along the way. So they stop at Santa Monica, at Los Angeles, at Fresno, and Visalia to make jumps from balloons with parachutes. By the time they get back to San Francisco, Joe Lawrence really understands how this works, how the rope works, how the parachute works, and they've got it working correctly. Meanwhile, Thomas Baldwin's back from the UK, making his own tour of the West now with balloons and parachute jumps. He comes to Albuquerque in September, has 2 failed ascensions, and finally gets a successful flight. So they're now competing to travel around the West to find the next big city that might pay you money to go do these exhibitions. But now Van Tassel has been traveling all the rails. And this is a map of the time where the rails were. You'd go on the rails from city to Albuquerque or over to Oakland or Stockton. And these are the cities you're going to be touring on. It's very limiting. And so why not take this exhibition to the world? And they decide to make a first stop by ship in Hawaii. So they have a whole journey planned. I'll talk about the journey coming up now, but really we're going to take American aerial exhibition to the world, starting in Hawaii. So they make 2 jumps in Hawaii, one at Kapiolani Park near Diamond Head, and the other near Punch Bowl near Pearl Harbor. And this first jump on November 2nd, 1889, Joe Lawrence makes a fabulous balloon ascension and parachute jump. It's the first successful parachute jump in Hawaii's history. There had been one balloonist that had came before and done a balloon flight, but no one had done a parachute jump. They realized that King Kalakaua has his birthday just a couple weeks later, so why not make another jump for King Kalakaua? We'll stay around in Hawaii. It's a wonderful place. So they wait till the 16th of November, and they set up near the Punch Bowl. Now, many of us who have been to Hawaii know that the trade winds come from the northeast there and are very strong sometimes, especially higher up you go, the stronger the winds get. And Joe Lawrence was asked if you want to wear a life preserver because there's still the chance you might get blown out to the water. And he said, no, I'm doing this in front of the king. I don't want to wear a life preserver. So they launch, they go up, and sure enough, the trade winds are really strong that day, and they start blowing the balloon with Joe Lawrence attached out to sea, and he releases over Honolulu, but still it's too late, and they both get blown out to sea. And the balloon lands and the parachute lands, but unfortunately, Joe Lawrence is never seen again. He drowned off the coast of Hawaii. And as the tales were, when the rescuers tried to get to him in time, they found sharks in the water, and over near Pearl Harbor, there were a big pot of sharks. And so maybe he was eaten by sharks, and that was the reason he died. It's probably more realistic that he had an iron ring to hang on to as a part of the parachute jump, and the weight of the iron ring forced him to go under the water, or he just couldn't get out of the parachute's way as they landed. But this gruesome tale of a parachute jumper being eaten by sharks off of the coast of Hawaii made international news, as you see here in this French publication. And there was considerable confusion because everyone had known this great Park Van Tassel parachute jumper, but who's this other Park Van Tassel? No one knew about him. So it must have been Park Van Tassel, the real Park Van Tassel, that had died. And Clara back in Oakland had to tell the papers, no, it was actually Joe, not Park, that had perished. A terrible thing that had happened for the tour. So now all of a sudden, Park Van Tassel is wondering, how do I continue? My aerial exhibitionist, my parachuter, is now perished. Do I continue on or not? And sure enough, of course, the show goes on, crazily as it is. So they continue on to Sydney, Australia. Park Van Tassel and the manager of the tour, Frank Frost, and they meet up in Sydney with a gentleman named James Price. He's the same parachute jumper that they had met in Salt Lake City. So it's pretty clear they had formed an arrangement to make these exhibitions around the world together. And they had scheduled a whole tour of Australia together. This is a map showing you briefly all the different locations. They land here in Sydney. They continue to Melbourne and Ballarat, Geelong, Adelaide, Townsville, Brisbane, Townsville, all the way up the Gold Coast of Australia, making parachute jumps as an exhibition, as a tour. And at this time in Australia was very hungry for American exhibitions and Americanism and things of that technology that would show Australia the way that America was doing things. Those first flights were in Sydney in December 21. Now James Price is marketed as James Van Tassel, yet another brother, and they're jumping from the Australia balloon. These are some of the earliest parachute jumps in Australia's history. They repeat this in Newcastle and West Maitland in February. As a part of the act, while the balloon's getting inflated, these are now not gas balloons, they're smoke balloons. They're balloons where you have a large fire, you're gonna hold the balloon over this fire, collect the hot air and the smoke, and then go up with the balloon, jump from the balloon's gonna fly off on its own and come down somewhere, and then you get to come back down by parachute. That's very different than a gas inflation and much easier to do. But as a part of that inflation, it still takes time. And they hired these Freitas sisters, 2 American sisters living in Sydney, to do trapeze work ahead of these balloon launches for the crowd. Some of these crowds were very, very large, 100,000 people waiting to see this event. The Freitas sisters wondered, hey, you know, maybe we could actually do the parachute jumping too, and just like Clara Van Tassel. And so in February of 1890, a very brave Valerie Freitas, now as Valerie Van Tassel, one of the family sisters, makes the first parachute jump in Australia's history by a woman. And not to be done up by her, Gladys does that just a few days later as the second woman to jump by parachute from a balloon in Australia. And these are the first women to fly in Australia's history. Both of those girls are immediately national heroes across all of Australia. All of the papers are wanting to see the Van Tassel sisters. They move on to Melbourne, making 2 flights in March of 1890. Literally 100,000 people turning out. If this is the modern SpaceX, you know, SpaceX launch we all go watch, or Apollo we all go watch. This was like the Apollo missions and the Apollo launches back then in the 1890s. You can see on the newspaper article on the left, they go up with this small trapeze bar, and they were actually performing trapeze work on this bar as the balloon is going up, crazily enough. And then they pull a rope, departing the parachute from the bottom of the balloon and coming back down by parachute. The only photo we know of one of these sisters is this one of Gladys. And very fortunately, we found this in the State Library of Victoria with their help. It's labeled Gladys Mantaso, yet another crazy type of Van Tassel thing, but her actual name was Gladys Freitas, which we pieced together through this history. They continue on to Ballarat and Bendigo and make other jumps. They go to Adelaide, make a jump, make 2 jumps in Adelaide for paying customers. But they have a falling out. James Price and Park Van Tassel have a falling out about how the troupe is being managed in these tours. And James Price and Millie Viola and his manager, Frank Frost, all go off on another tour of Australia, while Park Van Tassel, Gladys, and Valerie go off to Queensland. They split ways. I'm going to skip this Millie Viola one. I'll just mention that there were other women doing parachute jumping. It was again coming into vogue that these people would do this. These women would do this, and in fact, it was a family of Australian sisters called the Hawker family that ended up masquerading as the Viola sisters under different names: Millie Viola, Layla Adair, and Essie Viola, doing parachute jumping in both Australia and later in the US. They moved to Brisbane, and at Brisbane, at one of these parachute jumps, of course, they have to inflate this large balloon over a fire to get the balloon to get hot air to go up in the air. They have these large poles that are holding up the balloon and everything associated with it. And unfortunately, during one of these inflations at Brisbane, one of these poles fell and struck a young boy in the audience. They killed the boy. And that tragedy not only stopped everything from happening, but also led to a court case, and it had to go through, was it an accident or not? And clearly it was an accident. And the answer was to move the crowd back further from this and make the enclosure area wider from the balloon, which they did on all the rest of their exhibitions. But again, it led to a dark time for the tour. And then in Townsville in 1890, it turned out that at this event on a Sunday, the Australian Defence Force happened to be marching through Townsville that day. And why not go watch this balloon launch as a part of your march? So they go to watch the march. There were complaints, though, by people in the community. A Reverend Stewart complained that, how is it possible we could do this kind of balloon launching thing on a Sunday? It's the day of rest. We shouldn't be doing any of these kind of exhibitions, no less the women doing these kinds of exhibitions. It shouldn't be happening. And to make matters even worse, a major from the Australian Defence Force, who was married at the time, provided Gladys with a bouquet before she left. And again, in the papers, like, how could a married man who's in the Defence Force give a bouquet to an unmarried woman? And what would the wife think about this? And why is the Defense Force, why would taxpayer dollars going to pay to go do this thing? Why were they there in the first place? That was the issue, not the balloon launch. But because of the success, they did dedicate a street in Townsville called Van Tassel Street, which is still there today in Townsville. They leave Van Tassel, they leave Australia to the north to go to Southeast Asia, going to Indonesia, Singapore, Shanghai, the Philippines, back to Burma, and then off to India, all by ship. I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but you see that Gladys continues on with Park. Valerie takes a hiatus from everything else. They hire a new person to manage the tour, another Mr. Lawrence. And Gladys makes great parachute jumps all over Southeast Asia, making the first balloon ascension and parachute jump in Shanghai, perhaps one of the first of these in all of China. Now, Park Van Tassel has been gallivanting around Australia and now Southeast Asia with 2 other women. And Clara Corkendile back in Oakland is wondering what's going on. So she was granted divorce from Van Tassel at that time for desertion. And that was the end of wife number 3. At the same time, in all of this, as there were competitors in America, now there's competitors that are international. Percival Spencer from the UK is making balloon flights in India, making parachute jumps for Emperor Meiji in Japan as a part of the restoration in Japan, trying to get with technology in Japan was very interested at the time. Thomas Baldwin and William Ivey are making parachute jumps in New Zealand and Hong Kong and Tokyo. And James Price and Millie Viola continued making parachute jumps all around Australia and New Zealand. There were others too, in a race to try to get to the next big city, to be the first one there so you can make a parachute jump so that you can make the money to get to the next city. And that's your career, that's your job. They traveled to India from Burma. All these red dots are places where they made parachutes, probably many more. These are the ones I could find in newspapers. Valerie rejoins the troop in India. She's believed to make the first parachute jump by a woman in India at Hyderabad in 1891. But at Mysore, they make a balloon ascension, and just as the balloon is lifting off, maybe 40 feet off the ground, the balloon breaks open and Valerie comes plummeting down. Fortunately, she wasn't overly injured, but that was a pretty scary event. And both Gladys and Valerie had enough of this kind of life. They marry 2 wealthy Indians and leave Park again wondering, how do I find someone who wants to be my parachute jumper, because I'm not the one doing that. And so that ends up being a problem for Van Tassel. He leaves India to go to London to arrange with the newspaper, the London Graphic, to make a very publicized balloon flight across all of India from Calcutta to Bombay. While that balloon is being constructed, he returns to India. Now there's different reports of Van Tassel returning to India at different times. Clearly there were people that were masquerading as the great Park Van Tassel to try to make income doing these kinds of events. One person who is obviously an imposter made a parachute jump from a balloon in Calcutta, but landed in the Ganges and was swept away, almost died. And again, that made it in the papers that the great Park Van Tassel had almost died in the Ganges River, but it really wasn't him. When you're doing history and try to record these things, it's very difficult when you run into one of those kind of stories. He returns, though, to India formally with another lady, another woman named Jeanette Rumory, Jenny. And she's now Jeanette Van Tassel. Sometimes in the papers, it's Park's wife, or she's Park's wife. Sometimes she's Park's daughter because she's quite the younger woman. But they come back to Bombay and start doing these events again with her as the parachute jumper. They make many jumps across all of India from October to March of 1892, all these different locations, great events. And Jenny's a really good jumper. Here's a picture of Jenny Rumory on the left and Park Van Tassel looking very dapper from a studio in Calcutta at the time. When they get to Dhaka, Dhaka then was still part of India, but today Dhaka is part of Bangladesh. In March of 16th of 1892, Jenny launches in a balloon from a very well-known palace, the Asnan Manzil, a very beautiful palace on a river in Dhaka. And it makes a great launch with the balloon. They're going up, makes a great parachute jump. But as a part of the landing, she lands in a large tree at a place called Ramna Park, which still exists. And as a part of the rescue, the rescuers come with bamboo poles to try to bring her down from the tree. And as they were rescuing her, one of those poles breaks and she falls out of the tree and had severe injuries as a part of the fall. And unfortunately, she died 2 days later as a result of those injuries. She's buried still in Dhaka. Today, in Bangladesh, she's the first person to have ever flown in Bangladesh. And again, yet again, this makes international news because someone has died. Someone has died with the Van Tassel troop, and of course, no one had really understood that this was Jenny. And in the international papers, they remembered Gladys and Valerie, so it must have been one of them. And they report that Valerie's died, and it wasn't Valerie at all. They report that Gladys has died, and that's not true. And it was just a melee trying to figure out who actually this was, unfortunately. Van Tassel continues on. He makes several trips between India and London. He makes additional parachute jumps on his own. He marries again, wife number 4, Edith Ann Nolan, in 1892. But by 1894, he's off again on another tour, makes a jump in Sri Lanka, and that is believed to be the first balloon flight and parachute jump by anyone in Sri Lanka's history. So opening aviation for Sri Lanka. He continues on. He goes to Africa, to Zanzibar, to South Africa, up to Persia, makes jumps for the Shah of Iran, up to Russia, up through Europe, lots and lots and lots of other events happening here. I'm not going to go into detail on these. They're in the book, but you get the idea that he kept going and going and going and going and going on these tours. He finally comes back to India in 1895. He enjoys life in India, but suffers a stroke in October of 1900. And given a global depression that was happening at the time, and given his health, he makes the decision to return to California. But at that time, without Edith Ann Nolan, we're not sure if there was a divorce or what happened, but no longer, wife number 4 is no longer in the picture. But he comes back to a very, very different Bay Area. When he left the Bay Area, people were still amazed that you could go up in a hot air balloon. And in the time he's been away, people are now figuring out how to make dirigibles and how to think about making heavier than air flying happen. And there was a gentleman named August Greith in San Francisco who was experimenting with these dirigibles all the way from 1884, but really in 1903 and 1904, he had hired Thomas Baldwin to be his aeronaut in these big sausage-shaped balloons that had propellers on the side that would propel the aircraft through the sky. And Baldwin, as a part of this relationship, learns all about how to make dirigibles from his new friend, Dr. Greith. But these dirigibles, the propellers that are used on these dirigibles are very poorly designed. It's effectively like taking a ceiling fan and putting it on the side of the dirigible and spinning it really fast. There's no airfoil shape. It's not a very good method of propulsion. So Baldwin becomes very interested in finding who in the Bay Area knows anything about aeronautics such that we can design a better propeller. He asks around and he finds Professor John Montgomery at the Santa Clara College and works with Montgomery with a wind tunnel there at Santa Clara College to design better and better improvements for propellers, the shapes, the airfoils you would need to make this work better. At the same time, Baldwin proposes to Montgomery as a new exhibition, instead of having a balloon take someone up and they jump off with a parachute, why don't you take a balloon up with a glider underneath it and come down with the glider? Montgomery was a very famous glider aficionado. You could launch a glider that way and people might pay money for it. So they form a contract to develop this kind of a system with Baldwin making the balloons and Montgomery making the gliders. But as soon as Baldwin learns how to make the propellers from Montgomery, he's got the dirigible design from Greith. He goes to Los Angeles, starts to make his own dirigible called the California Aero, test flies that in the East Bay of the Bay Area with a great propeller on it, and goes to St. Louis in 1904 to win the 1904 St. Louis Fair for the longest flight by a dirigible. That was a $100,000 prize at the time, making Baldwin very famous. No credit back to Montgomery, no credit back to Greith. And as a part of that, Montgomery sues Baldwin for contract infringement. Baldwin sues Montgomery for libel. There's a whole court case that goes on. But Montgomery says, I don't need Baldwin's balloons. Who's a balloonist around here that can help me with balloons? There's a Van Tassel shows up. So Van Tassel and Montgomery team up briefly to do these kind of exhibitions with balloons taking gliders aloft in San Jose. But just as all that's happening and there's great success with aviation, along comes the Great Quake of 1906. And that ends a lot of aviation experimentation in the Bay Area for a period of years. Park at the time was living in East Oakland. And after this, re-engaged with these captive ascensions of doing weddings, things that were easy to do that would still have an income stream, not making great grandiose travels. He does briefly return to Salt Lake City to try to make a parachute jump, but again, competitors are there, and someone, a vandal, destroys his balloon by cutting slits in it before the balloon could be inflated the next day. And given all the confrontation and and the commotion and the competition, he decides to just return to San Francisco and not, or to Oakland, and not worry about this anymore. He realizes, though, that now he's older and he's becoming the sort of elder statesman of ballooning in the Bay Area. He's the one that's traveled the most. He has a considerable amount of experience with ballooning and with parachute jumping. And he starts helping other younger people form aeronautic clubs in the Bay Area simply to help to solve the fun of recreational ballooning. Not for money necessarily, but for fun and pastime. 2 of these aero clubs form in the Bay Area. One's called the Pacific Aero Club, another the Oakland Aero Club, and Van Tassel was really an instigator in both. And they construct a very large balloon called the City of Oakland with several impressive flights in the Bay Area. The first was on August 14th of 1909 with Van der Nalen as a co-pilot, as a passenger. Now this was quite an impressive flight. They took off from 14th Street in Franklin. I'll show you some photos in just a second. But they land in Pleasanton, and they land in a very unforgiving way with a 40-knot ground wind. And if you've ever been in a balloon, landing with any kind of wind is always an interesting thing. When you're landing in 40 knots, that's quite a considerable catastrophe. And they get dragged along the ground, and lots of Van der Nalen gets injured as a part of this event. But they're both lucky to survive. But it made it a fantastic, impressive flight. They do other flights as well. Here's a picture of that arrangement in downtown Oakland in 1909. You can see the crowd, and everyone's so eager to see this happen. They take off and barely miss the steeples of the church next door as they go up into the air. Again, you can almost make out the ballast that's on the side here so they can extend their journey in this very, very large gas balloon. Again, this was not a hot air balloon. This is a gas balloon that had used gas from the city to help get it inflated. And this one looks properly inflated finally. He also starts helping with balloon races. There's enough balloonists now in the Bay Area that they can start wondering who can fly the furthest. And they set up a thing called the Portola Cup in 1910 in the Bay Area. Again, filled with all sorts of harrowing adventures of landing in the bay and landing in, getting dragged across the bay into some of the swamplands in southeast South Bay near San Jose and things. But these are some of the first balloon races in America's history, really pioneering. He's also hired by the Goodyear Rubber Company, who's very interested in advertising, to come up with a new type of advertisement on the top of buildings in San Francisco. These are cigar-shaped, dirigible-shaped advertising balloons. And this is one of Goodyear's first adventures into anything having to do with blimps. So Van Tassel was the one that was hired to do that. And after these events, Goodyear started making the pony blimp and other types of blimps for advertising. As a part of this, Van Tassel also marries again a lady named A.F. Barr. We're not sure of her actual full name. They married in Oakland in 1912, and we're not sure what happened to Mrs. Van Tassel Barr. There's not a lot of record of her. There was another gentleman that he flew with, a younger gentleman. This is again the city of Oakland flying. In this particular flight, they flew to the west, not to the east. The winds were out of the northeast that day. Launching in Oakland, they ended up landing near Half Moon Bay. And they had to land on the mountain range near Half Moon Bay because if they didn't land there, they were going to be landing in the Pacific Ocean. So this was quite another harrowing adventure of having to get down as fast as possible. And then here we are, just in the middle of a pandemic, having to deal with Zoom lectures. But back then, there was another pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1918. And Van Tassel was now forced to largely be indoors and think about how do you keep things going? How do you make a living? He invents a mechanical toy, a slingshot, to launch this little tiny toy parachutist up into the air and have someone come back down, a little toy parachute come back down for kids. And this is invented in 1919, and approved in 1921. Not sure if he made any money off of this nice idea, but it's a cool toy. In the late 1920s, Van Tassel became a caretaker for a very large estate in Glen Arbor, which is near Santa Cruz. By 1930, he's moved back to Oakland. Oakland was his center of everything after he came back from India to live with his sister, Minnie. And unfortunately, on October 24th, he passed away at the sister's residence from a heart attack at Oakland. And that passing, again, made national news that the great Park Van Tassel had passed away, but the newspapers incorrectly reported as Parks Van Tassel or that he made his first parachute jump in Kansas City, which was not true. He made it in Seattle. The story of his life had been so already distorted that it wasn't clear what he had done, but he was an important balloonist, and that's good enough for the newspapers at the time. So this story is important for many reasons to me, and I think to Oakland and to Albuquerque. I mean, it's not as if he didn't know what he was doing. It took him a little time to get to know what he was doing, but he made his first flight in Albuquerque and had his last flights in Oakland. And during that time, he had this amazing life during an amazing transition in aeronautics from people not even understanding that it's possible to fly in a lighter than air balloon and paying to see that, to dirigibles and powered flight with heavier than air aircraft. And he was a pioneer in both ballooning and parachuting. And because of the speed at which he moved around the globe, around the West and around the globe, it was very difficult to piece this history together. I was very fortunate to team up with two gentlemen who are on the line today, Dick Brown, a Hall of Fame balloonist, and Rick Van Tassel, an indirect descendant of Park Van Tassel. And together they had collected certain pieces of this story as PDFs of newspapers and had shared that with me. But we all realized it was very difficult to piece the story together. And every time you take two pieces of this gigantic puzzle and put it together, you generate new pieces of the story and have to solve where he went next. And so that life in motion was very difficult. But realized that just 30 years after his passing in 1930, in 1960, a gentleman named Colonel Joseph Kittinger went up in a balloon with a pressure suit on, an astronaut suit, and jumped back down from the balloon at greater than 100,000 feet up, landing safely in New Mexico. So, I mean, it's just amazing. Just 30 years later, we can go almost to the edge of space and jump back down from a balloon with a parachute. And as Dick has said several times, that Van Tassel took ballooning to the world, and now the blue over ballooning comes back to Albuquerque for the fiesta. So I want to also remark that, unfortunately, of course, Van Tassel died during the Great Depression, and his family didn't have enough income at the time to put a marker on his grave at the Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland. And so he's been in an unmarked grave all this time. It's obviously deserving that he has a marker. And I've set up a GoFundMe that I'll talk about just coming up to help put that marker on his grave next year, at least I hope. And in addition, the location of Van Tassel's first launch in New Mexico's history in 1882, that's now a parking lot in downtown Oakland, downtown Albuquerque, and also deserving of a marker of the first flight in all of New Mexico. And of course, all the women that were associated with him, both the wives and the aeronauts that were courageous to jump out of things, they're all deserving of that recognition of what they did for women's rights as a part of this journey that Park helped solve. So I have this GoFundMe page. If you're interested, I'd love to have your support and help in this. If you want to take a picture of that QR code, you can also go to GoFundMe and look up Park Van Tassel grave marker. And we're trying to raise money to do this and get this done next year. I'd be happy to collaborate with anyone in the audience that might have assistance in this regard. And also I want to alert the crowd in Oakland specifically that we know from the newspaper reports at the time in 1900 that he came back from India with a very large scrapbook of all of his journeys of the world. Back then, it was very rare to have someone travel that much, and he was regarded as one of the world travelers at the time. And this scrapbook was its own adventure and its own interest to newspaper reporters at the time. But that scrapbook, we don't know where it is. It's been lost to time. It would have been a lot easier to write this book had I had the scrapbook, but that's gone. So if that scrapbook ever shows up, it absolutely deserves to be in the Oakland History Center or in the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta, Balloon Museum's archives. It needs to be preserved. Please be on the lookout for that scrapbook. So I had the pleasure of writing this book. It just came out in September of this year via University of New Mexico Press. 24 chapters of what I've talked about today. It's got a nice big glossary of balloon terms because even I didn't understand a lot of these terms, and Dick Brown had to help me with them. So if you're a novice like I was, you can certainly learn along the way, and you can check it out there. It's also available on Amazon, of course. And I want to make sure I acknowledge a lot of different organizations that helped me. Mainly, of course, not in person for a lot of these. A lot of this was all virtual. National Library of Australia, National Archives of Australia, but of course also right there at the Oakland Public Library and the Oakland History Center were fantastic with photos and assistance in this particular part of his journey that he stayed in Oakland. In the United States, many different researchers from many different libraries helped me along the way, and Dorothy and Emily in particular were very helpful. But there were other great archivists and librarians in Australia, in Southeast Asia, in India, Of course, all these people deserve to be thanked. And then, of course, the University of New Mexico Press was very kind to even take on this project. I had fabulous manuscript reviewers that helped me along the way. And most importantly, my family for being very patient in this, and my partners in crime on this story, Dick Brown and Rick Van Tassel, for all of their assistance. And with that, I want to say thank you. But before I open it up for questions, I also want to say a special thank you to Dorothy, because I hear that Dorothy is going to be retiring soon as a librarian in Oakland, and she's done fabulous work for so many years. And it's a thanks to her that we're here today. So thank you, Dorothy, for all you've done.
You are so welcome. Thank you very much.
So
it was great. It was fascinating learning about this. It was fascinating digging in our own archives to find more and more things. Just to let our audience know today, we have Albert Vandernaelen's, 2 of his scrapbooks, as well as a panorama that is part of his collection here. It's a framed piece, and there were certainly images that we wanted to share with Mr. Fogel, and to tell him basically what Emily did was to I think she photographed the whole thing. Did she do it in parts or as a moving picture and send it to you?
Yeah, in parts.
Because we didn't want to take this wonderful collection of images and notes out of its frame that it had been in since 1909. Right. But you know, it's projects like this book project that make the Oakland History Room such a fascinating community resource and collection, because every time, you know, the public offers up a research topic for us, we start building the collection more and more and find real gems in the collection, like that frame panorama. So thank you for doing this book. I want to show the audience this again as we open it up. Do you want to stop sharing screen?
Absolutely, happy to do that. Sure, thank you so much. And
so here's the book. It has a butter finish, which librarians love, or at least this librarian loves, and it has good book feel. And I was just telling Gary earlier that I love the fact that he added a glossary to it, because it's such a, I think it's safe to say it's a kind of a rarely known, a little known area of life that we don't have a whole lot of terminology about ballooning at all. And now I learned a gas bag isn't what I thought it was. I want to open it up to questions, comments. You can unmute yourself or put something in the chat. There are a couple of things in the chat actually that Gene Anderson, one of our local historians, has added. He's added Oakland Wiki has for those of you who don't know, there's Wikipedia pages, and then there are Oakland Wikipedia pages, Oakland specific pages. And he's added one about Albert Vandernaelen, and also one about Evergreen Cemetery, which has obviously a long history of receiving people who cannot otherwise afford to have a marker or anything like that. Evergreen Cemetery is most recently known as the place, the resting place for many of the unclaimed Jonestown victims. So it stands very large in our local history.
Marty had a question, it seemed, about the illustrations, and yes, some of the photos in the book were from the San Francisco History Center, with credit to them, especially that photo of the jump, Baldwin's jump, which is so amazingly rare, and I think it's the only one that's in existence. And we tried to piece together as many photos as we could for the book. Of course, whenever you're publishing a book, the publisher says thou shalt use only a certain number of photos, and that's the way it ends up being. So I try to add more photos to the presentations and bring it to life that way, but there are some of the photos in the book. And Question from Gene about hot air balloons versus city gas. Yeah, city gas was definitely problematic and expensive, and not everywhere in the American West and not everywhere around the world at the time. So city gas would have better lifting property, and maybe Dick, you can chime in on this and help me out, but definitely better lifting property for longer flights than a smoke balloon, for instance. And the smoke balloons, of course, they didn't like we do today for hot air balloons. So if it's a smoke balloon, you're going to heat it up once over this big fire. All the smoke and hot air gets into this balloon. You're going to get in the trapeze below it or a basket or whatever you're going to get into, go up. And then when it's cooling off and it's done, it's going to start coming down, and you can't regulate anything. You can't make it hotter again. It's just going to come back down. So you have a choice of either jumping or coming back down with it. And you might want to jump. So that's why smoke balloons were used. Dick, did you want to chime in on that at all?
One thing about smoke balloons, the smoke actually inside the envelope of the balloon helps to seal the pores of the fabric. It's a lightweight case. So in that way, you get a little bit better of an envelope of hot air. It's very dirty air, but that is what smoke ballooning was all about. And it's a whole lot easier to do than generating gas, illuminating gas. It was used for cooking and lighting, and it's created by burning coal in a low oxygen environment, but does not have the lifting power of hydrogen, which is what we use today.
Yeah.
I'd like to add something about the grave marker in Oakland. I think that is a great way to honor Park Van Tassel. By the way, it looks like I'm at the Grand Canyon, but really I'm in Albuquerque. And here in Albuquerque, we're starting to develop a similar plan to put a historic marker at the launch site, which is at Gold Avenue and 2nd, right downtown Albuquerque. That's probably a couple of years away yet, but I just want Oakland to know that Albuquerque is thinking of doing a similar thing to honor what is really our very first aeronaut in New Mexico. And now we're the balloon capital of the world.
There's another question from Marty about the fabric being used for the balloons themselves. And as I understand, the first balloon that Van Tassel used in Albuquerque to go up was made of cow intestines put together. Very stretchy material, very strong material, very hard to put together as a big balloon like that, but that was the way it was done at the time. Later, the balloons were cotton. I even think there were other types of lighter fabrics than that. Maybe Dick, you can speak to that, but yeah, the early balloons were interesting.
Oh.
There's a question from Darren. When the balloon was sabotaged and also the problems with the gliders and things, do you think it was competitive interference, attempted murder, no love lost between Montgomery and Baldwin? So yeah, unfortunately, it could have easily been someone that didn't like either Park Van Tassel or Montgomery, or felt that they were even just a competitor in their market, because if they're trying to make a living in that area, maybe that's the case. But it is the case that Baldwin was present in the Bay Area at the time of the launches of some of the Montgomery gliders with Van Tassel, and there were lots of issues with those particular launches. And so it's possible that he was the saboteur. We'll probably never know. But yeah, Baldwin, took ideas from a lot of people at a lot of different stages in his life. Baldwin's now in the National Aviation Hall of Fame, made fabulous work actually for bringing dirigibles to the Army, and also got into powered flight later in his life, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery in DC. Other questions, please, if you want to unmute and ask a question, please do.
I'm curious. So I'm just curious, did your previous research on Montgomery, is that where you first heard of Park Van Tassel?
Yeah, no, that's right. So thanks, Chuck. So exactly, I had written this Quest for Flight book in 2012 with Craig Harwood about a biography of John Montgomery, who was also a Bay Area hero of aviation. Happy to give a talk on that some other time. But given this association of Montgomery briefly with Van Tassel as a balloonist, I had always wondered who the Van Tassel character was. And at the time, didn't really have time to dig into it too much because I was focused on Montgomery. And then had the pleasure of meeting Dick Brown, especially, and Rick at a conference I was giving a lecture in New Mexico, and had talked to them briefly about Van Tassel. They had said they were doing some research and I might be interested in handing me a USB stick of all those PDFs. Started the big puzzle chase. It was really a lot of fun because realistically, you look at these papers and you get a hint of where Van Tassel might be going next on his journey, but then you have to go research those newspapers and then find did he go there or not. And you might have to look through a month's paper to figure out the one weekend he goes there. And then from that, you go to the next story. And that piecing together took its own time to do. But yeah, no, Montgomery was the lead in for me to this topic.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
What happened after, with airplanes coming on scene? What happened with ballooning? I mean, as a activity, as a sport?
Yeah. Yeah, great question.
Was there like this huge dip in like, oh, we're not going to do that anymore because we have airplanes now? But what ended up happening after the 1910s and stuff?
Great question. So of course, ballooning for recreational fun still continued on. There were people doing exhibitions and parachute jumps from static balloons throughout the Bay Area, Glen Park and other locations, San Francisco and in Oakland, for exhibition. So people were still doing that. It kind of faded with time. And by the 1920s and into Lindbergh's flights and Amelia Earhart's flights and Amelia Earhart's relationship to Oakland, of course, powered flight became quite popular. Maybe Dick, you can speak to the advent of hot air ballooning as a pastime and what it is today, and that difference between what it was in the 1910s, because Dick was involved with the renaissance of hot air ballooning in the 1970s.
One thing is gas ballooning continued because of the Gordon Bennett races, which were held all over different places in Europe and the United States. So that kept gas ballooning alive, even though aircraft started flying in the 1910, 1920s, 1930s. Hot air ballooning, as we know it today, did not really get started until about 1960. And it was Ed Yost and Don Picard who had a contract with the US Navy, and they developed a balloon that they thought could be used for training Goodyear airship pilots. At any rate, Ed Yost decided this could be a new sport. And what he did is he got nylon fabric for the envelope and propane gas for the burner and a lightweight basket, put all that together and started making test flights in South Dakota. And that's what really got modern hot air ballooning going. It hit Albuquerque in 1972 with our very first balloon fiesta, and that was Sid Cutter. And that really got things kicked off here, but also around the country, we started seeing hot air balloon rallies. And in Minnesota and California, even in Oakland, there was hot air ballooning in Oakland in the very early 60s. Well, hot air ballooning really grew after that. And well, it's what you see today. I mean, there are balloon rallies all over the country. Just a week ago, there was one in Page, Arizona, right there at Lake Powell. So they're happening all the time. But we have made improvements. The systems are better. The propane burners are much more powerful and more efficient. And the envelopes are stronger. Envelope is kind of the hot air bag. And the baskets, well, they started out to be aluminum and fiberglass, and they converted later to wicker baskets like the gas balloons we're using in the Gordon Bennett races. And that's what we see today in hot air balloon rallies around the country.
And now you can see why Dick Brown was such a great resource for this book. Thank you, Dick. Chris Silva has a question about early parachute. Did the early parachutes provide any legacy to modern parachutes? I certainly hope so. I think the difference between the rigid parachutes early on of the French versus the flexible parachutes that were being invented by Van Tassel and Baldwin in San Francisco, the flexibility of that was its own amazement. And then also the hole at the top to allow the air to escape and minimize the waffling effect coming down was also a good invention. Later, there was a packed parachute, and the invention of the parachute has its own amazing history. I've been contacted by some other people that are interested in that history, and Baldwin's associated for a possible association with that history. But as far as the flexible parachute with a hole in the top, I kind of credit it to Van Tassel and Baldwin. And if you feel like that is a grand ancestor of the Mars parachutes, then go ahead.
Marty has her hand up.
Marty, please go ahead, Marty. Unmute.
Thank you. I have never seen balloons flying in the Bay Area. I traveled kind of far to see them fly. So is anybody flying in the Bay Area now?
Great question, and I might rely on Dick for this one as well. I know here in San Diego, of course, there are balloon companies that still do ballooning in San Diego, and I was fortunate in high school to be to have a summer job as a chase crew for ballooning, because that was a lot of fun. But as the city has developed and as the Bay Area has developed, there's fewer and fewer places for them to land, and I assume that's the same thing for the Bay Area. It would probably not be safe to launch from Golden Gate Park today and try to fly across the bay as Van Tassel was doing way back when. So you have to travel into Napa or to the San Joaquin Valley or something else, Hollister or whatnot, to get out of the city environment to be able to land wherever you go. Dick, do you feel like that's true?
That is true. I think there's still a lot of ballooning in the San Joaquin Valley and the Napa Valley. But as everywhere, you need to kind of get out of the metropolitan areas because you can't steer a balloon, but there is not as many landing sites as there used to be. I think there's probably ballooning in Modesto, Fresno, Livermore, Pleasanton, Stockton. You just need to get away from the bay a little bit, or else you'll end up landing in the bay like Park Van Tassel did many times.
I got a question about balloon colors. So obviously, if it's made out of cow intestines, you're kind of limited in what kind of color palette you have. And of course, modern balloons are, I think a lot of the appeal of them are that they're just so brightly colored. I'm just curious about the colors of Van Tassel's balloons. Did he, the black and white photos, we have to guess.
I have no idea. It's a great question, Chuck. And of course, I would say they're black and white because that's all I know. But I just don't have an idea. Dick, have you ever thought about that? I really don't know the color.
I think that the gas balloons back in his time were kind of a dark gray, maybe kind of a dirty white, but no color at all. They did put some banners when they were trying to advertise a company. They had a sponsor and they would attach maybe a more colorful banner to the outside of the balloon, but the balloon itself is very plain. And that carried on well into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Even at the balloon fiesta here in Albuquerque, we have an annual gas balloon race as part of the fiesta. And those balloons are not really that colorful. Most of them are all white. So it's just a matter of not as easy to do the color work probably on a gas balloon as it is a hot air balloon.
And also, as a part of the story, I should mention in the book, I go through, you'll get the rhythm of how often Park Van Tassel and others were changing balloons and having to make new balloons because they just wear out. So all these balloons have a certain lifespan, and now's the time to have to make a new one. So when you go on a journey of Australia, for instance, you have to make 2 or 3 balloons to get through a journey like that. And then the expense of having to hire someone to help you make it, and where's it being made, and the time not exhibiting for the weeks of time that it's being made, that's all part of the factored into the exhibition.
I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead, Dorothy.
I wanted to ask Dick, are wicker baskets safer, or are they simply cheaper than aluminum? Why did people decide to use wicker baskets?
I think because they're more resilient, they would bend. If you land in a metal or a rigid basket, it's really quite a jarring experience. So I think very early on, they started using wicker because it would bend and flex a little bit during the landing. And that's when it's really important. And I think it was probably a little bit lighter too. Interesting thing, there's a few balloons that have flown here in Albuquerque that had clear, heavy plexiglass bottoms. That's like an elevator that you could look down through the bottom of the basket. Quite an experience looking down and through the bottom of the basket. Anyway.
There's one other question for you, Dick, from the audience, and I don't have the answer. How long do modern hot air balloons generally last?
Probably about what they do is they keep a logbook and they keep track of their flight hours, and usually it's about 200 to 300 hours. These balloons need to get annual inspections every 100 hours or so. I think it might be more frequent now. Probably the envelopes of today, the balloon I had was probably good for about 250, 300 hours. Today, I think it's more like 300 or 400 hours. There's some balloons that fly today that are on their 4th envelope. So eventually the basket's still good, but you might need to replace the gas bag, the envelope, after many hours.
And we have one more question from Neil. So money later, but early on, how did they supplement income? Great question. And again, the expense of the railways and all this, it really was quite the balancing act for any kind of aerial exhibitionist, which is why there weren't so many of them, and why it took someone like Park Van Tassel to just go do it across the American West. So I don't have a really good idea how he started generating it, how much the cost was for that first balloon. But absolutely the transportation costs were not inconsiderable, just pretty big.
Gary?
Yeah, Don.
You've talked about Van Tassel as what I'm assuming is the pilot and the promoter, but who was the designer? Who was the person who actually designed these balloons?
Wow, great question. The only answer I have for you is that there was this gentleman, F.F. Martin, in the Bay Area who already had been experimenting with balloons. And it's likely that Van Tassel just simply purchased one of those balloons. But the design of the gas bag with the nylon, the netting over the outside of it, again, referring to Dick, do you have any example of where that primary design came from? Because most of the gas balloons at the time were pretty much looking the same to me. Dick, any thoughts? And you're on mute.
Certainly, Park Van Tassel got training in how to build a balloon and also probably how to fly a balloon from F.F. Martin there in San Francisco. I don't think there were very many people building balloons back then. It was just really getting off the ground. I really can't answer the question in between the period of like 1880 to 1960. After that, there was a whole lot of hot air balloon manufacturers all over the country, in Idaho, in Georgia, North Carolina, California, South Dakota especially. So they were always designing and improving balloons as they manufactured them.
I see.
Well,
I'm sorry. I was just gonna say I see inspiration maybe from some Italian cheeses or sausages with the net covering that they have.
There you go, big flying sausages.
Yeah.
well, we're at our last minute. I want to thank Gary Fogel for working with us, for presenting this fascinating talk, presenting this book to the world, and including Oakland in it. Thank you very much. And thank you all for supporting the Oakland History Center. It's been my real pleasure these last 12 years to work in this particular department, to share the stories that come out of this great city. And it's just been my privilege. So I'm glad I'm ending my, at least my programmatic run here at the Oakland Public Library with this great talk. Thanks so much, everybody. So we're going to say good night, and thank you again, Gary.
Thank you, Dorothy, for all you've done and all you're doing. Appreciate it.
For sure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
All
everyone.
right. Bye, everyone.